Innovation is when you add something new onto something that's old and established. And in many ways, this kind of just looks like I threw on Cold Dot into an RF build. And in some way, I kind of just did that. That said, the setup for this build, the details are totally different than your mainstream RF builds that are on the market right now. Defensively, this thing is suppression capped, it runs Grace, Determination, a lot of evasion, mitigation. It's got about an 8k hybrid pool in the early mid game, and features one of the most offensively efficient elemental damage over time setups you can even run in the early game. Enabled by big multipliers not only from Righteous Fire, Bone Chill, but also EBMOM giving you a full extra aura, without sacrificing anything defensively at all. In my mind, this is the smoothest League Star that I can imagine. It's got great progression all the way through, and it bolsters Cold Dot's already relatively smooth clear with RF's even smoother clear, but it's got way better coverage, which means when you map, you'll see way less lingering magic packs and rare monsters. When you first get started with this build, it's going to level a lot like other Templars you've seen. You start with a Rolling Magma setup and a Ranger Mule where you make a Ranger and grab momentum, and then you play Rolling Magma linked with Elemental Proliferation, adding in Combustion to the third socket if you get a 3 blue. And the starting tree isn't quite as powerful as other starting trees, mostly because the first thing you want to do is make your way over to Explosive Impact rather than grabbing Discipline and Training and Holy Dominion. The reason we really want to do this is because right at level 16, you're able to respec into Righteous Fire if you really want to, and I think it's kind of a nice choice. RF in the early game, even though it has relatively small AoE, has really solid damage, like insane damage for a single skill, and I'm going to grab AoE nodes right away. So this tree at level 16 enables Righteous Fire because of this Fire Mastery. So as long as you have enough transmutes to craft onto Ruby Rings, you should be able to have enough fire resistance where you're getting quite a lot of fire res and in turn quite a lot of life regen. If you don't have any Ruby Rings, you can always buy an Iron Ring from the vendor, sell that with a red gem, and then you'll have a Ruby Ring, and then you can just craft on res on the bench. Even though your damage at level 16 while clearing will be pretty good, the single target will kind of suffer unless you keep using Rolling Magma with Flame Wall, Holy Flame Totem, that generic leveling setup that you see all the Templar racers do. So I would keep that going pretty much all the way until level 28. Another thing to note is that from level 16 onwards, you really want to be starting to farm Vol side areas, because that's where you can find Vol Cold Snap. Not only does this give you a lot of extra boss single target with the skill itself and Frenzy Generation on bosses, but it also gives you a really nice tool that can supplement your early clearing and give you that sort of double walking simulator, auto bomber aura sort of thing. Level 28 is where the first major crossroads in this build emerge. So on one hand, you could start to play something close to the endgame setup right away, throwing on the 3 Cold Dot gems, running that alongside of RF, maybe using your Flame Wall still for some extra damage. But that will tend to underperform just simply running an Armageddon brand setup alongside RF. So you can play Armor Brand RF. And the tree for that is actually fairly straightforward because you're only 1 point away from Runebinder. You can just grab that. And then you'd have sufficient brand scaling while also having the damage over time from RF and the ignite damage from Armageddon brand and all the fire synergies that go with that. The big reason not to go into Cold Dot early isn't because necessarily the setup isn't strong early, but it's that cold damage over time gems scale disproportionately with level. For some reason, the early levels you're getting like, 50, 40, 30% more damage per level, whereas in the late game, you're getting something like 10% more damage. I would, however, swap at around level 45 in the Chamber of Innocence into the Cold Dot setup. It's really nice that you can buy all the Cold Dot gems from the vendors without having to do library. As far as the early tree goes, you will be sacrificing quite a bit of power. It is possible to skip this area early on if you happen to run Vitality or happen to have enough resistance elsewhere to supplement your over-capped resist for the regen. But generally, I think this is really comfy, especially because of how strong flat life regen is. Moving into Cruel Lab, you get a lot of big, powerful nodes. So Spiritual Aid is one of those really big nodes that pays off after you get it, but while you're pathing over there, it really sucks. Not only does it give you some damage, and a little bit of extra damage here, but it gives you 1% regen from Righteous Army, which does matter quite a lot. I also go down to Divine Judgment because otherwise I find this tree kind of lacking in damage, even if you are running this mastery, because you're losing this major mastery, because we're not really a fire-based hit build, and that's what you usually supplement your Templar damage with a lot in the early game these days. When you move into Cruel Lab though, the most imperative thing is that you grab Eldritch Battery. The reason you want to do this is to make everything really smooth and allow you to run 2 full 50% auras all the time. It also would time out really well with you getting Pious Path, which is sort of the only node that really matters on Inquisitor. The first node is sort of just one that enables Pious Path, and at this point you'll find that your regen is basically something like tripled as to what it was before, and you'll have no recovery problems pretty much for the rest of the game. While there's nodes on the street that would give you more damage, when I'm pathing towards Merciless Lab, I actually go for both AoE clusters here and here because I think the playability and having smoothness and good coverage on RF and Cold Dot is sort of the whole point of the build. That's not to say you're not going to have good damage. Your damage will still be top tier just because the setup is so strong. If you find though that your damage is lacking, you can grab Whispers of Doom and run a second curse, Both Punishment and Frostbite will perform similarly. Frostbite will perform better as a tooltip, but Punishment also gives you that slight defensive mechanic of Debilitate, which can help out sometimes. In the final tree, there's mostly just a little bit of expansion down here. One big thing to note is that I actually path over here instead of over here on this final tree because I want access to Resourcefulness. This actually makes a really big difference, practically speaking, when you're trying to hit 100% spell suppression with early SSF gearing. So now that we've gone through the tree, let's look at the gem setup. In my main body setup, I'm actually going to run my Vortex and my RF because these are my primary clear skills. This is first and foremost a mapping based build for the early game, so I really want to invest as much as I can into this. And all the supports actually benefit both skills, and that's where the efficiency comes from. I also tend to opt for increased AoE over elemental focus while I'm mapping, as long as I find that my damage isn't lacking, but know that this is a swap that you can go for. In the late game, things like Empower, Awaken gems can be really strong, but I'm not even going to worry about that in the context of a League starter. One thing that's really cool and cool to note is that Life Tap will still work even if you are using Eldritch Battery. Eldritch Battery says you use ES instead of mana to cast your skills, but Life Tap completely circumvents that, changing your mana costs into life costs. Also, don't worry about the life costs. You're an Inquisitor, you should have enough regen. My dual curse setup goes for Elemental Weakness and Punishment, and Frostwing is definitely my movement skill of choice here because it's so much smoother than Flame Dash. My Aura primary setup runs Determination, Discipline, and Grace. You can try to find space for Defiance Banner if you opt for a Reservation Implicit or an Essence of Loathing on one of your pieces of gear, but I tend not to look for that too early, and that would probably then need to be put into an unset ring. The second damage setup goes in my gloves usually. It couldn't also go on helmet, but I find gloves tend to be a slot that's a little bit more flexible as far as the affixes you'll tend to hit go. I really want to be looking for a Fracture Suppression base and then using an essence of, I think, Delirium on them for this 30% damage over time multi. You then lock your suffixes and then Veiled Ashling and then try to hit +2 AoE on the prefix and with the Benchcraft Life. But this setup should look fairly familiar. It's just that I've moved Creeping Frost over to my gloves as opposed to my body and then taken out Hypothermia, Cruelty, whatever the usual 4th gem is in a Cold Snap setup. Shield Charge Faster Attacks my move skill of choice, though early on you're using Leap Slam and Faster. This can be kind of flexible, but I tend to find that this is, just what feels best, especially since you're playing Righteous Fire and Vortex, which are both walking simulator builds. So you want to be dealing damage as you travel in a fairly smooth motion. Lead Slam is like, you're just jutting forward and then you kind of have less lingering damage out. Arrogance Vitality is also in here, and this is pretty standard as far as RF setups go. Finally, I run a full level Divine Blessing with Malevolence. This can also be haste if you find that your damage is exceptionally high and you just want to go extra fast, and then a standard cast damage taken Molten Shell setup. Gearing wise, this is actually rarely flexible, especially if you're in softcore trade. If you're playing this build in softcore, I would not really worry about getting suppression cap in the early game. I would just get to like 40, 50, or 60% suppression, click this, and just call it a day, because that would give you something like 30% effective suppression. In HC though, I've kind of picked the gear specifically for what I think I'd be looking for if I were to play this in a start setting. In the weapon, you just want generic dot multi, and because we're taking Spiritual Aid on the tree, and because of how annoying it is to craft elemental damage on these kinds of things anyway, you're looking to hit this with an essence for minion damage, and then benchcraft, cold dot multi, cast speed, +1 all. Those kind of mods are also good, they're listed here. For the shield, again, I'm leveraging minion damage. Spell damage is also decent if you go for a pure ES base. If you want to go for more suppression, you can go for a hybrid ES evasion base for a really high suppression roll. And then if you really feel that your Physmid is lacking, both Dawnbreaker and generic armor shields can be quite strong. On the helmet, I'm looking for big powerful mods for this build that are pretty standard. It's really important that you try to look for life regen on this because you're not going to find it in a lot of other places. Moving into the body, I tend not to look for a life roll explicitly onto here because I really like grabbing the 15% life mastery on the tree. If you don't have any life modifiers on your equipped armor, both life regen and flat life will apply here, so just be careful. If you do happen to hit that, don't take the mastery. Fizzazz, this Gravicius mod, just like Corel over here, tends to be a pretty important mod because Inquisitor doesn't have a lot of baseline physical mitigation, and you can see that my armor on this build with Flask down is relatively low, especially for a Templar. The gloves are a completely offensive slot the way I see it in this build, and then as far as those implicits go, things like Cold Dot Multi are also replaceable, but that won't scale your Righteous Fire, which is a big portion of your clearing damage, which is sort of the feature of this build, right? The cold exposure though is worth taking. You can also opt for a suppression implicit to make your gearing easier, but it just sort of depends on what your whole setup looks like. And frankly, each time you try to recreate this character, I think the puzzle pieces will be slightly different, but the core concepts are still the same. For boots, early on, look for Scorched Ground. Life regen is a great implicit to hit, but then obviously as far as most dot builds go in the elemental sense, they grow for Legacy of Fury. These are sort of target farmable off of Maven. They're fairly common, but they will be fairly expensive in softcore trade. I remember the last time I played in softcore trade, I was flipping these at about 2.5 to 5-ish divines on day 1 and 2, so Just be wary of that, and that's why it's not in the starter POB. For jewelry, I really like this bench crafted focus shock because there is some degree of ailment scaling. You can also craft non-damaging ailments on your amulet or your boots. That's a good offensive mod, but there's not that much suffix space if you're looking for all these other offensive mods. And then over here, I think Frenzy on kill and Endurance Charge on kill are both valid modifiers to look for that are really, really powerful for your mapping. Lastly, for the belt, any rare belt is good. Just note that this bench crafted mod for flat armor and flat evasion is actually quite powerful. And then later on, you'd want to try to hope for Immortal Flesh because this is obviously a great thing for an Inquisitor, which has low armor base. This supplements that, gives you a ton of regen, catalyst it up, ton of life. Just good for any damage over time Inquisitor, especially since this value does double from Pious Path. These flasks are pretty standard. Just one thing to note, I tend to look for a quartz flask instead of a jade flask. Phasing, especially for an RF build, is just, really important. It is possible though that you drop the silver flask if you hit onslaught on kill boots. Just something to think about, something to keep your eye out for. And then lastly, I do look for this jewel for power of purpose. For this build, it's really just for armor. But you can get some pretty powerful mods to be slotted over here. The problem with doing that though is that sometimes it can brick some of the big notables like Divine Judgment, Faith Seal, Life, and this all can possibly get shifted into something else entirely. It just depends on what you're going for, but one really good mod you could look for is Cloistered, which gives you immunity to elemental ailments when you're on consecrated ground. If you do hit that, I would consider trying to grab more nodes in this area to hit 150 devotion, but it's a pretty hard puzzle to solve even knowing that. All that said, I think if you start this build and follow these steps, you'll have a really, really smooth league start. If you want to scale the damage further and stay on this existing build setup, all you have to do is start looking for generic elemental damage scalers and then +1 spell damage or +1 cold on a lot of places on your gear, and it'll shift slowly more in towards that cold dot archetype as far as your damage goes. But even then, it would still kind of be an innovative build because I don't really see a lot of cold dot Inquisitors, right?